Good morning, afternoon or evening, and welcome to another episode of Marginal Gains. If you've ever wondered how the best players boom their population so quickly or manage their economy while you just seem to be floundering, then you're not alone. However, it is worth noting that there's a difference between the fantastic play you'll see from the very best players and the effective play that's required that allows them to shine. So unless you're competing at the very highest levels, then it's going to be effective play rather than genius that's the difference between winning or losing. And effective play starts with your basic setup. So let's see what changes we can make to our fundamentals that will lead to us booming, fighting, and eventually winning better. So just to go over what we'll be covering, this video will be showing you a little bit of how to use the options menu, control groups, and hotkeys to ensure you have maximum control over how you play. You can then take this knowledge and adapt it to fit your own needs. If that's cool, let's get looking at the first of all of these, which is the options menu. The main things you need to be aware of in the options menu are the first two that you'll see, and these are the wounded unit health level and the batch training size. The wounded unit health is the percentage health that a unit has remaining that will make 0AD consider that unit to be injured. Now the reason for this being important is that there's a hotkey to select only injured units, which is normally used in raiding as it allows you to make a quick attack, then use the hotkey to select only the injured units, send those back to the civic centre to be healed, while the ones that are not injured can continue raiding. So this option allows you to decide at what point you no longer want units on the front line and want to see them in a temple or your civic centre recovering. Now personally, I set this to 33%, but I recommend that you practice to find the right level for you and then you select that. The batch training size is different. This should, in my opinion, always be set to 1. The default is 5, but I don't find this to be a useful level. And the reason for that is it leads to time waiting for resources if you don't have enough to train 5 units at any point in time. And that's dead time, which is the enemy of progress. So by setting it to 1, it basically means you can batch train however many units you want. If you set it any higher, you're always going to run the risk of not having enough resources to train 2 units, but enough to train 1. And then that would leave your production center idle, which is a criminal waste of time. So those are the keys in the options menu, and they're the adjustments that I recommend. So let's move on to see how you can use control groups. Now for me, the secret with control groups is not so much how they're used. I have a video for that, which is on the link on screen now if you'd like to know more, but it's about making sure that you use them consistently. And this means that you can instinctively know which control group includes which units and or buildings. So I'll first go through the control groups that I use and then explain why I've arrived at the conclusion that those work best for me. Just to say again, they may not work best for you, but I do recommend 100% having a consistent numbering system. So first up is number 1, and I use this for the civic centre, and I will select the civic centre and allocate this as soon as I start the game. This means that I can easily select that building to train new units, even if the building itself is off screen at the time. Now this is especially useful in relation to early attacks or scouting, as it means that I can just follow those units around on screen, see what's going on, and quickly select the civic centre, queue up some units I want to train, and then get back to selecting the other units and carrying on raiding or scouting. And to make this easier, I can also set those other units to another control group, so I won't need to use the mouse to select them at all. I will just flick between the number for the civic centre and the number for the control group, and it's all done. Number 2 is the group that I use for all my buildings that can produce units, but not including the civic centre. Now early on this will mean the barracks basically, but later it can encompass the fortress and other troop producing structures like the temple. Now you may wonder why this is kept separate from the civic centre, and it's a good question because many people would put all the unit training buildings together in the same control group. However, I personally like to keep my civic centre for producing just women earlier on, while the barracks produces soldiers. And if you add them into the same control group and then try to select produce soldiers, it will produce from both the civic centre and the barracks, and that means I can't disaggregate them and make women from one and soldiers from the other. Now this will become less of an issue as you move through the game, and you won't produce so many female citizens in Phase 2 and Phase 3. So I can see that moving them all to the same group after Phase 2, for instance, would make sense, but for me, I'd just like to keep them separate. And I'd recommend, though, that you just do what works for you. I'm only explaining my rationale. Number 3 is one that I use for just scouting or rushing groups of soldiers. So basically, this is any group that I may not have on screen but would need to control. That's a nice simple one. Number 4, I will use always for the blacksmith, and that's so I can easily find it for upgrades. It is very, very easy to forget the location of your blacksmith in the heat of battle, and this takes care of that issue, and it hopefully means that your upgrades to your troops will arrive a little more quickly than they otherwise would. And the final group that I use is number 5 for the market, and this is again so I can easily find it if I want to make trades. As with the blacksmith, not knowing where it is on a map when you're in the middle of a battle is a very, very easy situation to arrive in. And because prices move so quickly, any delay in finding the market can actually cost you quite a lot of resources. So making sure I always have it in the same control group at number 5 really helps with this. And the final part of the puzzle for effective and efficient play is knowing certain hotkeys. And these are going to help to increase the speed with which you can select units and allocate them to either resource gathering or fighting. So if you ever had a situation where a large group of units are in one area, some of those are hard at work and some are sitting idle, they're taking a break. Well, that might be okay in the real world, but in 0 AD, taking a break is unforgivable. So there are 2 ways to deal with this. Now in general, you could use the full stop key or period key if you're in the USA. They're the same key, but like we say Z rather than Z, the US has changed its name for some reason. So to select idle workers one at a time, you press the full stop, and each time you press it, it will scroll through all your idle workers, selecting them. Or you can press Alt plus full stop, and it will select every idle unit that you have on the map all at once. Now this is a broad brush approach, and there are 2 situations in particular where you may not want this. The first situation, where you may want to select only a subset of units, is select idle fighter, and this will select only citizen soldiers, champions, etc., and it will leave any idle female citizens alone. Now this is useful if you want everyone who can be involved in an attack on the front line, while leaving those more susceptible to just dying back at the back, away from danger. Just like the full stop method, this involves using / to scroll through idle fighters and Alt plus / to select every single idle fighter. And that's probably the one that you're going to use more often. The other situation is where you want to select all idle units, and that includes fighters and female citizens, from a geographical location rather than from the whole map. The most common is where you've got exactly 23 soldiers and 1 woman on a mineral mine, and then that mine deposit runs out. You may want to select just those units so that you can allocate them to a different metal or stone deposit, but leave any other idle units where they are so they can be allocated differently. To select only idle units in a particular area, you just hold the I key while using the mouse to select an area. And within the box that you've selected, you'll see that only those that are currently not working or walking to somewhere will be selected. This is one of those things that's so useful that once you use it, you'll begin to wonder how you ever lived without it. And on that, a little aside, if you've installed AutoSieve, this is going to reallocate the I key, and that means that this brilliant trick won't work. So clear it out of AutoSieve if you get the chance, and if you want to know more about that, Jim Cogan's Newbie Rush channel has a great video on AutoSieve and how it works, and that's linked now. Finally, you can use / in the same way as full stop or / to select all idle units, be they workers or fighters, but I find this isn't used very often as generally you will want only one of those groups. Either you want to select all the people you can send to fight, or those that can do work for a task. That said, it's worth knowing about for completeness if nothing else. And moving on, selecting only wounded soldiers is something that we looked at in the options menu section, and to do this you just use the O key. This works in exactly the same way as using I for selecting idle ones does, but with O. So draw a box with the mouse while holding O, and you've got only those soldiers selected that have health at a lower percentage than the cutoff you selected in the option menu. So that one's pretty easy. And finally, we have something so simple and useful, and again, not used even nearly enough for my liking. When telling soldiers to move somewhere, use Control right-click rather than just right-click, as this will make soldiers attack if they see enemy units on the way. If you've ever noticed that moving your soldiers to the front line, in doing so they just seem to walk past some enemies and end up being attacked before they reach their destination, and in some cases dying, then not using this is the reason why. So just do it. It's simple and it saves lives. A lot like looking both ways before crossing a road. And although I said finally at the beginning of the previous sentence, as an addendum I just want to talk quickly about the hotkeys for training. Now I can see how these could be useful, but I don't use them personally. So if you basically select a building, then you can use the bottom row of keys starting with Z to select the first, second, third, etc. unit to train. Now I prefer to use my left hand on the shift key and select units with the mouse, but I can see this could be useful if that's how you wanted to play. However, I just seem to lack the dexterity to do this, so I won't recommend it unless you are particularly well versed with your hands. You now have all the information required to set up and control your faction in 0AD matches in a very effective way. So if you like this video, then hit like, subscribe, all that jazz. Just stay safe though. I'll see you next week. Muito obrigado e adeus.